Chapter 43. Josh made it through the living room and into the kitchen before he started to feel the pain behind his right eye. He stopped and closed his eyes as he waited for it to fade. It wasn't nearly as bad as it had been the first time he had been in the Sea Lodge. It was dull instead of sharp, and it was quickly over. He felt around his eye, but there wasn't any of the salty discharge that there had been previously. His mind was also still clear. Poe had said something about him not being compatible with whatever that thing was that he had been infected with. Maybe the dull pain was some sort of lingering after effect from the parasite. He shook his head and opened his eyes. There would be time to sort through things later. For the moment, he needed to concentrate on the matter at hand. The kitchen was mostly like he remembered it. Someone had cleaned it, though, and the layer of dust that had clung to everything was gone. He went into the bedroom and found that the cleaning extended to there as well. It would have taken quite a while to clear off that much grime. He wondered how long Jenni had been trapped there. Time passed differently in the lodge. He'd experienced an entire day inside, but only minutes had gone by in Lamplight Woods. Apparently quite a bit longer had passed for her. He returned to the kitchen, but hesitated before checking outside. Jenni clearly wasn't in the beach house, and he knew that he needed to check the beach itself, but he remembered the sounds that he had heard after dark while he'd been trapped there. There was no question in his mind that something unnatural lurked outside when the sun set, and it was now night. Glancing back towards the living room to make sure that the door was still open, Josh went down the small set of stairs leading to the beach. The night outside was somehow brighter than the inside of the house, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The moon was huge, taking up a large portion of the sky and illuminating the world with its brightness. The rest of the sky was filled with stars. It was oddly quiet, and he quickly saw the reason why. The ocean was all but gone, leaving only a thin layer of water that reflected the moon and stars. Standing along the edge of the water was a long line of people. He recognized most of them as residents of Lamplight Woods. They were standing completely still as they gazed out over the water. "Josh?" a voice said from his left. "Josh Taylor?" He turned to find Jenni Grant slowly approaching him. She was dressed in different clothes than she had been wearing back at the carnival, and her hair was quite a bit longer. There were dark circles under her eyes. He couldn't be sure, but he thought that she was also thinner than she had been. "Mrs. Grant, thank God," he said, keeping his voice low even though there didn't seem to be anything threatening nearby. "I've come to get you out of here." She stared at him in disbelief for a moment. "You know a way out?" "Yeah, through the door in the living room." "That door doesn't open." "Not from this side, no. We got it open from the Lamplight Woods side. Come on, we have to go." "What about these people?" Josh looked back over at the Lamplight Woods residents standing by the water. She had a point. If they left the lodge and closed the door, it would basically be abandoning a large part of the town. "Okay, you go ahead and go back to Lamplight Woods," he said. "If you're not through that door soon, the sheriff is going to come charging in, and I don't think either one of us wants that." "What about you?" Jenni asked. "I can't just leave you here." "I'll be right behind you. I'm going to see if I can get these people to wake up. If I can't, I'll leave and we can figure something else out." "I don't like this." "I'll be fine. I have an idea. Now go." She gave him one last look before turning and hurrying back into the beach house. Truth be told, he didn't have any idea what he was going to do, but he hadn't wanted her to argue. The look on Sheriff Grant's face had been one of concern and impatience, and he was worried that she would only allow so much time to pass before coming in herself. He walked over to the nearest person to him, feeling the soft sand crunching under his shoes. He recognized her as Dora Langley, a girl a year older than him that attended his high school. They weren't friends by any stretch of the imagination. When his parents had died, she had been one of the first kids to tease him about it. He had never understood why children found that sort of thing to be fodder for jokes. On the plus side, her winning personality made it easier for him to use as a human guinea pig. She didn't respond when he waved his hands in front of her eyes, and she remained completely still when he loudly clapped his hands together less than an inch from her face. Not sure what else to do, he leaned in closer for a better look. He frowned. Her right eye was slightly bloodshot, and there was water running down her cheek from directly under it. He went down the line to the next person, and then the next. They both had the same redness and excretion. Everyone there had been infected with one of the parasites that Poe had tried to force on him. For some reason, his brain hadn't accepted the presence of the parasite, and it had died before being ejected from his body. What he was seeing was the result of minds that had allowed the parasite to take over. He felt a chill go down his spine. If it wasn't for some random twist of fate, he would have been just like them. He had no idea how to get rid of the parasites. His had been removed when he had vomited, but that was after it was already dead. Trying to deal with live ones was something else entirely. Josh went back towards the house. The only thing he could think of was to get Sarah and hope that the coat she had used to open the door could also get rid of the parasites. From there, they would just have to somehow sneak half the town through the carnival without getting the attention of the carnival workers or the feral vampire creatures roaming the area. He made a face. Yeah, nice and simple. He went into the house and through the kitchen. As he stepped into the living room, he noticed that he was feeling a very slight vibration coming up through the floor. He had been so preoccupied outside that he hadn't noticed it. Ignoring it, he hurried to the door leading home. When he was just inches away, the door slammed shut. He was too close to stop, and his body hit it hard. Luckily, he was able to turn his shoulder ever so slightly, and it prevented his face from striking the wood. Feeling panic beginning to creep into him, he grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it. It was locked. Swearing loudly, he kicked the door as hard as he could, but even as he did so, he knew that it was futile. He was once again trapped in the Sea Lodge. Chapter 44. Maggie felt a huge weight lift from her as Jenni emerged from the doorway. She immediately grabbed her wife and pulled her into a tight hug, feeling her eyes starting to fill with tears. She had managed to keep everything internalized since she and Michael had arrived at the carnival, but now that she knew that Jenni was safe, the internal dam had broken. "Damn it, Jenni," she managed to say in a choked voice. "I thought that I lost you." She expected a sarcastic comment, or at least a small joke. Jenni always leaned towards humor when she was in an emotional situation. Instead, though, she simply clung to Maggie, her fingers digging in tight. When they finally released each other, the sheriff looked at her closely. "Are you okay?" she asked as gently as she could. "No," Jenni replied immediately. "I'm not okay at all." Maggie had noticed that Jenni looked exhausted and that she had lost weight. Now as she took a closer look, she was surprised to see just how much her wife had changed. Not just physically, but also just the way that she carried herself. The bubbly, good-natured happiness was gone. It had only been a few hours, but it was like she had been gone for months. "Where's Josh?" Sarah asked with obvious concern in her voice. "He'll be out in a minute," Jenni answered, pulling away from Maggie. "There are other people trapped in there. He's trying to—" Before she could finish speaking, the door leading into the Sea Lodge slammed shut so hard that it shook the porch. Sarah swore and tried to open it again, but it didn't budge. There was a short laugh behind them, and they turned around to find that they weren't alone anymore. "Hello, Sheriff Grant," Sylvia Poe said as she brushed the long side of her hair over her shoulder. "I see that you managed to find your poor missing wife." "Open the door," Sarah demanded as she took a step forward. "Or you'll do what?" Poe asked calmly, barely paying attention to the girl. "Be quiet, child. The adults are talking." The peacemaker was already in Maggie's hand, and she brought it up to point at the woman as she made sure that her body was in front of Jenni. She felt the anger beginning to rise in her. For the first time since Leo had informed her that her wife had been taken, She was face to face with one of the people responsible. "Are you really going to kill an unarmed person?" Poe asked with a tiny smile. "Come on, Sheriff Grant. You and I both know that you're not going to pull that trigger." As much as Maggie hated to admit it, the woman was right. She wasn't going to kill someone in cold blood no matter what that person had done. She gritted her teeth and stayed silent. "That's what I thought," Poe said. "I'll tell you what. Why don't I give you a reason?" The woman snapped her fingers, and a burst of fire sprouted from the tips. Maggie barely managed to move out of the way and pull Jenni along with her as the flame licked the spot they had been standing less than a second earlier. As they fell, Maggie fired the peacemaker, and Poe cried out as the bullet went through her hand. "You fucking shot me!" she yelled in both shock and pain. "You're lucky I was off balance," Maggie said as she got back to her feet. "If I wasn't, it would have gone right through your forehead. Turn around, get on your fucking knees, and put your hands behind your head." "You actually think that you're going to, what, arrest me? Me? I'm going to tear your heart out, bitch." "Better people than you have tried." Poe snarled as she curled her injured hand into a fist and held it up in front of her. Maggie felt her entire body clench up as if she was being held by a giant hand. She struggled against the unseen force, but could barely move. The air was slowly being pushed out of her lungs, and she gasped as she unsuccessfully tried to breathe. Sarah attempted to charge directly at Poe, either to try to take her off her feet, or to at least try to get the woman's attention off of Maggie. She simply waved her other hand, and the girl went flying back up onto the porch and into the wall of the building. Realizing that she couldn't pull the peacemaker's trigger, Maggie opened her hand as wide as she could. The gun fell out of her grip and landed at her feet. As she had hoped it would happen, Jenni's hand lashed out from behind her and grabbed the weapon before rapidly squeezing off 2 shots. One of the bullets stopped in midair and fell to the ground, apparently stopped by Poe. The other round dug itself into the woman's shoulder, however, and suddenly Maggie was able to move once again as Poe's hand spasmed and opened. She bent down and took the gun back out of Jenni's hand. Poe had been caught off guard by the resistance they were putting up. She took a few steps back and kept her injured hand close to her body. Maggie shot at her again, unloading the 3 remaining rounds at different parts of the woman's body. All 3 shots fell to the ground short of their targets as she concentrated on defending herself. Sarah stepped back into view as she charged once again, forcing Poe to turn her attention to her. At first, Maggie wondered why the girl wasn't using the coat to fight magic with magic, but she realized that Sarah must have been worried about using the last of the coat's magic and not being able to retrieve Josh. It was impressive that she was able to remain so clear-headed in such a dangerous situation. The first time Poe had been able to easily brush off Sarah's attack. However, Sarah was ready now. Instead of continuing forward when Poe pointed at her, she dove and wrapped her arms around the woman's legs. They both went tumbling to the ground in a heap. Poe managed to get to her feet first, but Maggie was already heading towards her. She rammed into the woman with her shoulder as hard as she could. There was a satisfying crack of bone as her shoulder connected hard with Poe's jaw. Blood flew from her mouth as she crashed into the ground again. Maggie was on top of her before she could even try to get up. The sheriff rained hard punch after hard punch down on her, all the pent-up rage bursting out. Poe tried to defend herself by putting up her arms, but soon they fell to her sides, and she lay helpless on the ground as she was continuously battered. With a final strike directly to the nose, Maggie stood back up. She was panting heavily from the exertion, and her knuckles were throbbing and most likely bleeding inside of her gloves. She looked down at Poe as sweat poured off of her face. The woman was still alive, but her face was ruined, and each breath was ragged. "Fuck you," Maggie spit out. There was a movement to her right, and before she could react, Jenni was on top of Poe. Her wife pulled something out of her pocket and plunged it into the side of the witch's neck. Jenni let out such a primal scream that Maggie physically recoiled from her. She'd never heard anything remotely like that come out of her before. Jenni pulled the object out of Poe's neck, but before she was able to stab with it again, Maggie snapped out of her shock and grabbed her arm. Jenni struggled against her for a moment before her head drooped and she dropped the weapon. Whatever it was, it resembled a prison shank. "I had to do it, Maggie," Jenni said quietly. "I had to show them that I'm not afraid anymore." Maggie looked over at Sarah helplessly. The girl was staring back at her, with horror in her eyes. Chapter 45. Michael watched as Bingo slowly walked towards one of the tents and disappeared inside. After watching and listening intently for several minutes, he stepped away from his hiding spot and debated his next move. Part of him wanted to go investigate the tent to find out just what Bingo was up to in there, but he rejected the idea. There weren't any windows, and he certainly wasn't going to trap himself inside of a closed space with the creature. Besides, he knew where Bingo would eventually end up. He would be going to the place that Sarah and Josh called the Sea Lodge. Things were starting to come together in his mind now. From the conversation he had overheard, it was clear that Bingo and Poe were going to attempt to break the bargain they had made with the ancient being she had gotten her powers from. It sounded like they were going to do so by killing it while it was in a vulnerable state. To do that, they needed the key that she had taken from Forgotten Tales. Josh had said that Poe had opened the Sea Lodge with a special key. The key she had stolen from him was a different one, but it was marked as being from the Blackwood Lodge. What were the odds of that being a coincidence? Besides, there were what could best be described as rumors, whispers even, stories that very few people knew about a place known only as the Lodge, a place that existed outside of both time and space, much like the hidden study at Forgotten Tales. If the rumors were to be believed, though, the Lodge was so much more. It was thought to be both infinite and sentient, all-encompassing and yet also separate from the universe. It was a place of contradictions, a place that was impossible to truly understand. He'd come across scraps of information about it when he had tried to research the origins of the Blackwood Lodge key. None of it had made much sense, and it had led to nothing but dead ends. Now, though, he believed that everything that was happening was somehow connected to this mysterious lodge. The sound of gunshots filled the air, soon followed by screaming. Michael looked in the direction that they had come from, but his view was blocked by the buildings and tents. He was sure that they had come from the direction of the Sea Lodge, though, and they sounded a lot like shots from Maggie's peacemaker. He was about to start heading that way when he saw movement from the corner of his eye. He ducked back into his hiding place just as Leo came around the corner. At first, Michael thought that the man was looking for him as instructed by Bingo, but when he headed directly towards the tent the creature had gone into, it was clear that the only person he was looking for was his boss. Bingo emerged from the tent just as Leo reached it. The wind chose that moment to blow harder, making it impossible for Michael to hear what they were saying. The sudden loud outburst from Bingo was easy to understand, however. "What do you mean, she's dead?" Bingo practically screamed in rage. "Like I said, Poe is dead," Leo replied in a much calmer tone. "I was by the Sea Lodge and saw it happen. That bitch sheriff and Dyer's kid killed her. The sheriff's wife helped, too. She was too weak from the ritual she used to bring you back to stop them." Bingo stared at him. "You're telling me that you were there when it happened, and you did nothing to help her? You just let it happen?" "There were 3 of them. I couldn't—" Before he could finish, Bingo lashed out and floored him with a vicious backhand. Leo was lifted completely off of his feet and crashed into the ground several feet away. The man quickly scrambled back up as he spit blood out through the mouth of his mask. "All right, that's enough of that," Leo growled. "Both Bango and Poe are dead. You don't have them to protect you anymore, old man, and without Poe, your entire plan is out the window. I'm done taking your abuse." Bingo regarded him for a moment before bursting into laughter, his face changing into its nightmare state. "I'm sorry. Did I hear you right?" Bingo asked. "Did you actually say that you believe Bango and Poe were protecting me? Me? Holy shit, do you have your facts screwed up? I protected them. I gave them a home. I gave them a family. I gave them everything." "Bango had the strength," Leo spit back. "Poe had the magic. You're just some cancer patient that got stuck in a puppet for decades and is now in the body of a rotting corpse. I've been waiting for this for a long time." "Well then, no need to keep waiting, kitty cat. Show old Uncle Bingo what you've got." Without warning, Leo's left hand reached into his suit coat and produced a thin knife. Even from this distance, Michael could tell that it was old and dull. It wasn't much of a weapon. The lights near the stage suddenly went out, and the entire area was plunged into darkness. It was far darker than it should have been, with shadows covering everything like a thick blanket. "Oh my," Bingo said happily. "I had no idea that you had Carwinhow. Wherever did you find it?" Michael recognized the name. Carwinhow was a legendary dagger that had supposedly been one of King Arthur's most prized possessions. The old story said that it could shroud its user in shadows. Apparently those stories meant that quite literally. "So your plan is to make it harder for me to see you," Bingo continued. "Congratulations, you've managed to achieve what Sunset does every single evening. What's your next play? Are you going to use a bedsheet to make yourself look like a spooky ghost? Oh, I know. You're going to leave a flaming bag of dog poop on my doorstep, right?" "Not quite," Leo replied smugly, his voice seemingly coming from nowhere. "I just needed to buy myself a few seconds." The darkness disappeared as the lights came back on. Leo was standing a few yards from Bingo, and in front of him was a massive black dog. It was nearly as tall as the two men. Its fangs were bared, and thick drool dripped from its jaws. Its eyes glowed with a dim blue light. Michael was so focused on the monster that it took him a few moments to notice the dog collar in Leo's hand. "Well, hello there, puppy," Bingo greeted the animal. "You seem friendly." "Gite Rash," Leo commanded slowly. "Bring me his head." The giant hound lunged forward. Its jaws opened wide as it bore down on Bingo. Michael didn't know much about Gite Rash, just that it was an English myth and it was considered to be a death omen, and he watched in fascination. Bingo continued to grin as he reached out and shoved his arm directly into the mouth of the hound. The creature's eyes went wide and it yelped in surprise. He grabbed its tongue and lifted the animal off of its feet before slamming it down on the ground so hard that Michael could feel the rush of air from the impact. The hound laid still before turning to smoke and fading away. "That was a good effort," Bingo noted. "I have to admit that I'm just the teensiest, tiniest little bit impressed. I knew that you always wanted to be the guy in charge, but I didn't guess that you go to these lengths. Like I said, I'm impressed. That's not going to stop me from killing you, obviously. I'll just do it with a little more respect than I normally would." It was impossible to see the expression under his mask, but Leo's body language made it clear that he was starting to panic. He dropped the collar as he reached back into his coat. Moving with inhuman speed, Bingo lunged forward and caught Leo's hand before he could retrieve another object. The grin on the demonic creature's face broadened. "No more toys," Bingo told him. He pulled Leo's hand back out of his coat. As the masked man began to scream, he opened his demonic mouth and bit down into the forearm. With one hard jerk of his head, Bingo ripped Leo's arm off of his body and spit it onto the ground. Leo's screams grew both louder and shriller. Bingo clamped his right hand down on the man's mouth to silence him. "That part about my plans being out the window because Poe is dead?" Bingo said slowly. "You always thought so small. If Poe isn't here to take that impotent god's power, I'll just have to do it myself." Bingo put one hand on each side of the man's face and squeezed. The struggling abruptly ended, and Leo's head collapsed inward under the immense pressure. Bingo opened his hands and allowed the body to fall to the dirt. "I know that you're watching, Mikey," Bingo called out, wiping his bloody hands on his pants. "I hope you enjoyed the show." Chapter 46. Michael watched as Bingo walked away from the mangled body and went back into the tent he had been in. He found himself staring at the scene in disbelief. The killing of one of Bingo's own followers had been so quick and effortless. Forcing himself to move past the shock, he stood up and cautiously walked over to the body. He was about to break one of the primary rules that his grandfather had taught him: never handle magical or cursed objects that you don't understand. Having just watched what Bingo had done, however, he knew that he was going to need as much firepower as he could get his hands on to stand even a slim chance of surviving an actual fight. He was just going to have to learn how to use Leo's objects on the fly. He was disappointed to find that the dagger was damaged beyond repair. It was lying on the ground in pieces, the blade having snapped off the hilt. Judging by the condition, it had been in bad shape to begin with, and it must have hit the ground in just the wrong way when Leo fell. Next to it was the collar that was used to summon Geitrash. He picked it up and put it into his back pocket. He already felt like a grave robber, but he knew that it was about to get worse. Leo had been reaching into his coat when Bingo had stopped him, which meant that there must be something else inside. Being careful not to touch any of the blood or bone fragments that covered the coat, Michael carefully opened it and fell along the inside until he found an inner pocket. Inside the pocket was something square and hard. He pulled it out and found that it was a ring box. Glancing back at the tent Bingo had gone into to make sure he was still alone, he opened it. Sitting on a black velvet cushion was a perfectly round orb. It looked like a pearl, but instead of the usual milky white color, this one was red. He had never seen anything like it before. Whatever it was, he certainly wouldn't be able to figure out what it could do or how to use it without doing a lot of research, something that he didn't currently have time for. He closed the box and decided to keep it just in case. Michael looked up as he heard the sound of cicadas filling the air. The strigoi had begun to descend from the Ferris wheel, and they were looking in his direction as they moved. Making one last check that he hadn't missed anything, he stood back up and hurried back to his hiding spot. The strigoi surrounded the dead body and began to lap up the blood. He was reminded of nature documentaries of hyenas surrounding an antelope carcass. In a way, what he was watching was a dark reflection of exactly that. It was disgusting, but at the same time, strangely fascinating. He debated if he should try to find out what Bingo was doing in the tent, but he decided against it. The structure didn't have any window flaps, and he certainly wasn't going to go inside. The risk outweighed the gain. Besides, he needed to check on those gunshots he had heard coming from the direction of the Sea Lodge. That was where Maggie and the kids had gone, and he needed to make sure that they were all right. Being as quiet as possible so as not to attract the attention of the strigoi, he made his way back around the outside of the carnival towards the lodge. With the exception of the cicada-like sound of the proto-vampires, the place was eerily quiet. Everything had happened so fast, and he couldn't remember if it had been this quiet when he and Maggie had arrived. He was pretty sure that there had been music playing, but he wasn't sure. He wondered where all of the carnival workers had gone. He hadn't been there when the carnival had opened, but it would have taken quite a few people to run something the size of what he was seeing. There wasn't anyone around now, though, and in an odd way, that was just as disquieting as what he had just witnessed. Something else was off about the carnival. Making sure that he was still out of sight of the strigoi, he stopped moving and knelt down. He wasn't exactly sure what was different, but something had definitely changed. His eyes fell on a nearby tent, and the answer clicked into place. The material of the tent itself had changed. He crept closer to get a better look. It was the same crimson color that pervaded the carnival, but instead of being made from the same plastic that it had been, it was thicker and rougher. It looked a lot like red flesh. Poe had told Bingo that a god named Call was waking. Between this and the giant eye, Michael wondered if that physically affected the world around it, or maybe the carnival itself was some manifestation. There was no way to know for sure without knowing exactly what this call was. The sound of cicadas grew louder, and he turned his head towards the noise. 3 of the strigoi had broken away from the group that was tearing apart Leo's body and were coming towards him. They hadn't seen him yet, but their faces were close to the ground as they sniffed at it. They were tracking his scent. That didn't make any sense, though. Strigoi could only track the scent of blood. How could they have followed him? He looked down at his injured finger and swore quietly. The bandage was soaked, and as he watched, a small drop of blood dripped from it and onto the ground. The liquid bandage he had filled the wound with must not have kept the wound shut, or maybe he had reopened it at some point. It didn't really matter. What did matter is now he was being followed by 3 highly dangerous creatures, and there could easily be more in the way. Michael glanced over in the direction of the sea lodge. He couldn't go there no matter how much he wanted to help Sarah and the others, at least not yet. If he did, he would be leading the strigoi right to them. He needed to get rid of the creatures that were following him, get his wound under control, and come back. He would just have to hope that Bingo didn't make his move before then. He continued on. Instead of continuing around the loop towards the lodge, however, he went back into the area of the carnival that housed the individual exhibition tents and the larger performance tent that he and Maggie had been in earlier. It wasn't much of a plan, but he figured that if he headed back towards the food vendor stalls, he might be able to find a first aid kit. If not, he could try to rig something up with napkins or whatever else was handy. He made a face as he took the right path and headed towards the entryway. It was actually a pretty terrible plan, but it was the best that he could come up with. A blonde woman in a blue dress stepped out of one of the flesh-like tents in front of him. Michael took out a silver knife and pointed it towards her. She looked at the weapon with an unconcerned look on her face before turning her attention to him. "Unless you want those strigoi that are following you to rip you to pieces, come inside," she said, pushing the tent flap open for him. Chapter 47. Sarah tried for a 3rd time to get the door to the sea lodge to lead back into the beach house, but for the 3rd time, there was only the empty room when she opened it. She stepped back and tried to keep control of her frustration and fear. Either she was doing something wrong, or Crowley's coat had run out of power. She ran her hands through her hair. If she couldn't get the door to work, Josh would be trapped inside. Time worked differently inside of the lodge. By the time they were able to find him, he might already be dead. For all she knew, the fight with Poe might have taken too long, and he was already dead. She forced those thoughts out of her head. She had to stay focused if she was going to help him. If the roles had been reversed, she knew that he would have done everything that he could to stay laser focused on the problem and the solution to that problem. As she prepared to try again, she glanced over at the edge of the porch where Jenni was sitting. Maggie had her arm around her, but she didn't even seem to notice. After killing Poe and declaring that she had to do it, she hadn't said another word. Whatever had happened to her in the lodge had done something to her, something that had very much changed her. The thought of that same kind of change happening in Josh broke her concentration. No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't fully set aside her concern for his safety. Her mind didn't work like his did. She wasn't able to compartmentalize nearly as well as he could. She was more impulsive and driven by emotion than he was, and a thought came to her. She might not even need to use the code to get inside the sea lodge. Hopping off of the porch, she went over to Poe's body and stared down at it for a moment. She didn't like the idea of scavenging from the dead, but she didn't have much of a choice. Kneeling down, she ran her hand over the woman's dress until she felt an odd lump near the waist. After probing with her fingers for a moment, she found a key attached to a blue oval keyring. Sarah hurried back up the steps and returned to the door. Closing her eyes, She took a deep breath and inserted the key into the keyhole just above the doorknob. There was an audible click. She reached out with her other hand and turned the knob before pushing the door open. She opened her eyes. To her relief, through the doorway was the beach house and not the single empty room. Without pausing to think about it, she went inside and looked around the dark entryway. Josh wasn't there, so she continued on into the kitchen. He wasn't there either. There were 2 ways out of the kitchen, a door leading into another room and a second one that led outside. She checked the inside door first. Behind it was a bedroom with a small bathroom. There was no one inside, so she returned to the kitchen briefly before going outside. The night was breathtaking. The moon, larger than she had ever seen it, lit up the beach in such a way that the sand looked like it was glowing. Stars filled the sky, and the light from all of them was reflected in the nearby water. Standing in front of the water was a long line of people. They were facing away from her, but she thought that she recognized some of them from the carnival. She had found the missing crowd. "Sarah?" a familiar voice said from behind her. She turned to see Josh coming around the back of the house. He was holding a long, thick branch that had been fashioned into a pointed spear, and he was staring at her with a mixture of caution and relief on his face. "That is you, right?" he asked. "You're not just some new way this place has found to fuck with me?" Sarah didn't answer him. She simply looked at him silently, feeling different emotions washing over her. She hadn't realized just how much she had been worried that she wouldn't see him again. It wasn't the time to be thinking about that kind of thing, and she absolutely knew that, but she didn't care. "Do you remember what I told you about my great-grandfather's theory of paranormal entanglement?" she asked finally. "Yeah," Josh replied, clearly confused by why she was bringing the subject up. "You said that he believed that paranormal events are linked to one another somehow, and that the reason so many strange things end up in Lamplight Woods is because of that connection." "Right. My father called it a supernatural magnet. Lamplight Woods draws paranormal things to it." "I'm not seeing where you're going with this." Sarah paused. What if Lamplight Woods also draws people together? People that are meant to be together, like how my mom and dad were connected from the first day that they met." "It's possible. I feel like we learn something new about the town every day. Why are you asking me this?" "It's just..." She shook her head in frustration. "I'm not making any sense. I'm trying to say that we've known each other for less than 5 months now, and there's this thing that..." She looked at him helplessly as she tried to find the right words. After struggling for a few moments, she decided that it was time to stop overanalyzing things. "Oh, fuck it," Sarah said, walking up to Josh. "I'm trying to tell you that I love you, you idiot." She reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. At first his body was stiff with surprise, and she wondered if she had made a mistake. That fear was proved unfounded as he wrapped his arms around her and returned the kiss. She wasn't sure how long they stood there holding each other, but eventually they separated as if by some unsaid agreement. Her face was extremely warm, and she hoped that the night concealed the redness. There wasn't much chance of that given how bright the moon was, but she tried to keep the hope alive anyway. "We should, get back," she said as she tried to fight down a goofy smile. "Yeah, we should," Josh agreed, sounding extremely distracted. Okay. You seem to remember something. Wait, no, we can't go back yet. I need your help with these people." He led her down to the water's edge and the people that were standing in a straight line along the shore. All of them looked like they were in some kind of trance. The closer that she looked at them, the more that it looked less like a trance and more like they had simply been shut off. "What's wrong with them?" she asked. "They have those parasites in them," Josh responded. "Remember how I told you about that disgusting thing that was inside of me? They've all got one, except their bodies didn't reject them like mine did." She quickly assessed the situation. "We need to use the coat to get the parasites out of them." Exactly what I was thinking. She looked over at him. I don't know if there's enough magic left in this thing to do that, and if there is, there's definitely not going to be anything left afterward. Josh nodded. We better make sure the door of this place stays open before we do anything then. Whatever we do, we have to hurry. We don't have long. I know. Bingo could show up at any moment. It's not Bingo that I'm concerned about. He turned slightly and pointed out over the water. At first, she struggled to see what he was trying to show her. There was just the shallow sea and the sky. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a dark shape at the horizon. It was too far to make out what it was, but it extended a good distance across the water. What is that? Sarah asked. I have no idea, Josh replied in a tense voice. All I know is that it's been getting closer every minute. Chapter 48. Maggie stared at Sarah for a moment as she processed what she had just been told. The girl had just informed her that a good portion of the town's population was inside the Sea Lodge and possessed by some parasite that they were planning on extracting through the use of a magic coat. There was also some giant thing that was headed towards the possessed people from across the ocean. It sounded completely insane when laid out like that, and yet she instantly accepted it as fact. She wondered when the exact moment that she had become so accepting of Lamplight Woods' craziness had been. What do you need from me? She asked. Just keep the door open, Sarah told her. We'll do the rest. I'm on it. Be careful in there, okay? I don't want to have to explain to your father how I lost you inside of a magical beach house. I will. Sarah disappeared back into the lodge. Maggie turned to once again face the carnival, her hand on the holstered peacemaker. She was running low on bullets for it, and she had the feeling that she was going to need it again sooner rather than later. She would just have to make every shot count. The strigoi had left the Ferris wheel, disappearing out of sight behind it. There had been sounds of a fight from over in that direction, and the noise had drawn the creatures away. She hoped that Michael wasn't in the middle of whatever had happened, and that he was safe. Jenni was sitting on the edge of the porch, her legs pulled up to her chin and her arms wrapped around them. Poe's blood was still on her hands and face. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She had said that she had to kill Poe, and that she had to prove that she wasn't scared anymore. Jenni was a staunch detractor of the death penalty. She had said on more than one occasion that taking someone's life in any situation, except for self-defense, offended her as both a person and as a nurse. Maggie looked at Poe's body before quickly looking away again. The woman hadn't been in any position to threaten them when Jenni had jammed her makeshift weapon into her neck. She had been beaten into submission and knocked unconscious. It had been a cold-blooded killing. She wondered just how long Jenni had been in there to cause her to change so much. An entire day had passed for Josh, and he had only been inside for a short while. Jenni had been gone for hours. It could have been weeks or months. That was assuming that time had passed at the same rate as it had for Josh. For all she knew, it could have been years. She sighed. She had just wondered when she had gotten used to Lamplight Woods' weirdness. The truthful answer is that she hadn't, at least not fully. She doubted that she'd ever be totally comfortable with it. She knew that whatever had happened to Jenni while she was in there had a profound effect on her. Her wife hadn't just decided on a whim to kill someone. It wasn't in her nature. At least, it hadn't been. The problem was that, in a way, that didn't matter. The killing had happened. While she loved her wife dearly, Maggie was also Lamplight Woods' sheriff. She took the oath that she had sworn when she had taken office very seriously. Both under the law and based on how she would have handled this situation with anyone else, she should arrest Jenni. Her reminding herself about the kind of person Jenni was, and that there were extenuating circumstances, was just her trying to justify not making that arrest. She knew that this was the case, and yet she kept internally making excuses. Michael had killed a man earlier that night, and she hadn't arrested him. How could she make an exception for him and not her own wife? The rational part of her mind firmly reminded her that the circumstances simply hadn't been the same. Michael had killed Bango while not only defending himself, but her as well. Poe had been incapacitated when Jenni had killed her. The two situations were completely different. She looked back over at Jenni. When this was all over, she would have to make a choice as a sheriff. That would have to wait, though, because at that exact moment, she was needed more as a wife. She went over to the edge of the porch and knelt down so that she could put a hand on Jenni's shoulder. She wanted to sit down with her and hold her, but it was too dangerous to do so. A hopefully comforting hand on the shoulder was the best that she could muster, while staying upright and holding the peacemaker with the other hand. "You must think that I'm a terrible person," Jenni said suddenly as she kept staring off into the distance. "I don't think that," Maggie assured her. "Sure you do. Part of you does, anyway. I just murdered that woman." Maggie hesitated for less than a second. "It isn't that simple. You've gone through a lot." "I'm glad that I did it, Maggie. If I could do it all over again, I would do the exact same thing." She said it with such conviction that Maggie was momentarily speechless. The statement had been calm, and the tone of her voice hadn't had any hint of remorse. "Do you know what's inside that house?" Jenni continued. "Monsters. Real monsters. There are these fish people things. When it rains slugs that drag themselves into the ocean. And there's something else, too. Something huge and ancient and so far beyond us." "Jenni," Maggie began. Her wife ignored her. "When I was in there, I thought that those were the only monsters. When Curioso came into the house with all those people from Lamplight Woods, though, I started to realize that everyone working for this carnival is a monster, too. All of them. They're all monsters, and they deserve to be put down." "That's not a call for us to make," Maggie said. "We can't be judge, jury, and executioner. There are laws." "I don't want to hear about the laws," Jenni snapped. "Do you think that the law helped me at all while I was in there? Do you think that any of these people give a shit about the law? Forget about government laws. They don't give two fucks about the laws of nature." "I don't care if they care about what's right and what's not. I'll deal with them, and I'll deal with them on my terms. I care that you still know the difference." "I absolutely do. Hell, I understand that better than I ever have. I was naive for a long time, Maggie. Even after fucking demons started killing kids earlier this year, I still believed that there was a line that had to be walked. With most people, there still is. I'm not saying that's not the case. I'm saying with the people at this single particular carnival, they need to be put down like the animals that they are." Maggie regarded her closely for a long moment, a feeling of inexplicable loss filling her. "I can't believe that any one person is allowed to make that kind of judgment call, Jenni. I love you. I love you so much, but I just can't." Jenni looked up at her, her face stony. "I love you too, Maggie, but in this case, I guess there just isn't anything left to talk about."